50 years later, MLK's Poor People campaign is back and more needed than ever before. And I thought this article was very fitting. Wednesday marks the 50th anniversary of Dr. Martin Luther King's death, and most politicians have chosen to commemorate his legacy by tweeting out some choice quotes and leaving it at that. At the time of his death, however, Reverend King was doing more than crafting speeches, inspirational speeches, that is. He was laying the groundwork for his Poor People's Campaign, an intersectional movement dedicated to eliminating poverty in America, the richest nation on earth. And King helped to organize 3,000 people's protest campaign on Washington Mall for 6 weeks. After King's death, the movement tragically lost most of the momentum. 50 years later, a Reverend Dr. William Barber II and Reverend Dr. Liz Theo Harris have resurrected his movement with chapters in 40 states, all of them guided by the same mission, challenging the country's distorted morality and replacing it with something just. It's hard to overstate just how radical King's Poor People's Campaign was at the time of its inception. The term intersectionality didn't exist. The civil rights struggle for African Americans and economic justice for low-income whites were seen in opposition to one another. The latter, of course, is still true today. And so it goes on to talk about how King was moved to tears in 1967 after traveling to Marks, Mississippi and seeing some of the nation's impoverished people. Children whose parents were too poor to give them a blanket, a Head Start teacher who was forced to cut an apple in 4 quarters to feed them to her hungriest students. The curse of poverty has no justification in our age, King said. In his 1967 book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? It is socially as cruel as and blind as the practice of cannibalism at the dawn of civilization, when men eat each other because they had not yet learned to take food from the soil or consume the abundant animal life around them. The time has come for us to civilize ourselves by total and direct immediate abolition of poverty. King sought to organize a Poor People's Campaign led by the country's poorest, most disenfranchised individuals. And so he demanded an economic Bill of Rights that included a guarantee of basic income, full employment, and more low-income housing to be inclusive of most all. So after the campaign presented their demands to the Congress, King organized a resurrection city in the camp. The participants, they stayed 6 weeks, and this was in 1968. And this is a picture of the camp. It was called Resurrection City. So to fast forward it to now, and precious little of King's vision for economic justice has been achieved in America, or has it? I don't think so. There's still much work to be done. So the numbers here are really alarming, but it's true. And so it says that in the richest, most developed nation on earth, 17.2% of the population lives in poverty, and 21% of all children live in poverty, with disproportionately higher rates for Black and Latino children. The United States ranks 18th among the top 21 most developed countries in terms of poverty, inequality, economic mobility. It is 23rd in income inequality, lagging behind Turkey and Slovakia. When political candidates on the left and right do the talking about inequality, their language tends to be about middle-class jobs and working families. The word poverty is almost left out of the equation almost always, as if it no longer exists or poor people who suffer from it don't really matter. But Barber and Theo Harris' Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, hopes to change all of that by creating an intersectional movement outside of the two-party system that focuses on saving American souls from sins of militarism, systematic racism, environmental destruction, voter suppression, and poverty. Though we reignited last year, it's intensifying in 2018 with actions planned for communities of color as well as traditionally white areas, including Rust Belt, Central Valley of California, Appalachia, among other places. We need more revival in this nation, Reverend Theo Harris, campaign co-chair, said in Detroit recently. It isn't necessarily a spiritual or religious revival, but to have a revolution of values. So in March, the campaign traveled to Selma, Alabama to cross the infamous bridge, later organized folks struggling with insufficient wastewater treatment. A few weeks later, it went on to Harlan County, Kentucky, and South Charleston, West Virginia. And here's some people that are involved in it, along with Dr. William Barber. Beginning on Mother's Day, the campaign will launch dozens of initiatives across the nation, from direct action to voter registration to nonviolent civil disobedience, leading up to a mass mobilization at the U.S. Capitol in June. And this is another photo. And so, in conclusion, this article is about to end, but it goes on to say the intensity of the actions, the diversity of its goals, and its geographic distribution mirrors King's initial design for Poor People's Campaign. King knew that the campaign would have to be sustained and intersectional if it were to have any type of success, and low-income folks would have to be in leadership. So we ought to come to Washington in carts, mule carts, old trucks, any kinds of transportation that we can get our hands on. This is what he said at the time when they were protesting. So the photos up top were Dr. Reverend William Barber speaking at a conference or a museum that was an NCR museum about the Revive Poor People's Campaign. The most radical and progressive shifts for the good in the U.S. history have always occurred when concerned citizens join together across racial lines. And so this is a photo of him and the people. And so it goes on to say 50 years later, the campaign hopes to turn King's unfinished initiative into sustainable justice. And so the statement that was made back then, people ought to come to Washington, sit down if necessary. We are here, we are poor, we don't have any money, and you made us this way, and we have come to stay until you do something about it. Those are some strong statements I thought were very inspiring. So if you dishonor the movement and you dishonor the prophet, if you just remember the prophet without the revival of the movement that prophet stood for, it means nothing. So it's like when they have every year the marches and they have the little mini marches and they have like the parades and they just are, you know, commemorating his birthday, but there's not much deep talk about who he was as an individual, and now we're getting that even more so, which much need. It goes on to say that nothing would be more tragic than for us to turn back now. And this was under Reverend Dr. Barber. It was said in Memphis on Wednesday. And so I thought this was an important article to bring about. These are some photos of of the people that were involved. This is an old photo of Resurrection City. And this is Dr. William Barber, Reverend Dr. William Barber. And so this is out of Yahoo, and it was entitled 50 Years Later, MLK's Poor People Campaign is back and more needed than ever, which is so true. Like, comment, subscribe, and thanks for listening.